A world where the name James Bond doesn't conjure the image of a suave, steely-eyed Scotsman sipping a martini, shaken, not stirred. Hard to picture, isn't it? That's because one man carved that image into the soul of cinema so deeply that even decades later, it's impossible to unsee. Sean Connery wasn't just an actor, he was a force, a legend who didn't just play 007, he became him. But what if I told you his tragic death didn't just silence a Hollywood titan? It brought an entire era to a screeching halt, leaving even films he never starred in, like The Man with the Golden Gun, feeling the echo of his absence. Stick with me, because this isn't just a story about a man's passing, it's about how one life shaped a legacy so vast, it still ripples through time. Let's rewind the clock to 1962. A relatively unknown actor steps onto the set of a modest spy flick called Dr. No. He's got a thick Scottish burr, a rugged charm, and a presence that could stop a train. That actor was Sean Connery, and that film was the spark that lit the James Bond franchise ablaze. From the moment he uttered those immortal words, Bond, James Bond, the world was hooked. He wasn't just playing a character, he was defining one. Over the next decade, Connery would don the tuxedo in 6 official Bond films, each one cementing his status as the gold standard of 007. From Russia with Love gave us his cunning, Goldfinger showcased his charisma, Thunderball proved his grit. By the time You Only Live Twice rolled around, Connery wasn't just a star, he was a phenomenon. But here's the thing about phenomena, they don't last forever. After Diamonds Are Forever in 1971, Connery hung up his Walther PPK, or so we thought. He'd grown tired of the role, frustrated by the fame, the typecasting, the endless demands. "I've done Bond," he famously grumbled, "and I'm moving on," and move on he did, into a career that proved he was more than just a spy with a license to kill. Films like The Untouchables, which snagged him an Oscar, and The Hunt for Red October showed a versatility that silenced the doubters. Yet no matter how far he strayed, the shadow of Bond followed him. It was a shadow he couldn't escape, and maybe, deep down didn't want to. Now let's talk about The Man with the Golden Gun. Released in 1974, it's the 9th Bond film, and the second to star Roger Moore, who'd taken the reins after Connery's exit. On the surface, it's got nothing to do with Sean Connery. Moore's Bond is lighter, wittier, a touch more playful, almost a counterpoint to Connery's brooding intensity. The plot pits 007 against Francisco Scaramanga, a deadly assassin played by Christopher Lee, armed with a golden gun and a penchant for theatrics. It's a classic Bond romp, exotic locations, a menacing villain, a touch of camp, but dig a little deeper, and you'll see Connery's fingerprints all over it. Not in the credits, but in the DNA. See, Connery didn't just leave a role when he walked away from Bond, he left a blueprint. Every actor who followed had to reckon with his legacy. Roger Moore once said, "I knew I couldn't be Sean, no one could," and he was right. The Man with the Golden Gun came at a turning point for the franchise. The producers were desperate to keep the magic alive, but Connery's absence loomed large. Fans whispered comparisons, critics debated whether Moore could carry the torch. The film itself, while a hit, felt like a bridge, a shaky step from Connery's gritty realism to the flashier gadget-heavy era that would define the 70s and 80s. In a way, it was Connery's shadow that shaped it, even if he never set foot on the set. So how does a man who'd long left Bond behind halt a film like this with his death? To answer that, we need to fast forward to October 31st, 20. Sean Connery was 90 years old, living quietly in the Bahamas, far from the Hollywood spotlight. He'd been out of the public eye for years, his health declining, his voice, a gravelly roar that once commanded screens, fading to a whisper. That Halloween morning, he slipped away peacefully in his sleep, surrounded by family. The news hit like a thunderclap. Tributes poured in from every corner of the globe. Daniel Craig called him one of the true greats. Pierce Brosnan said he'd cast a long shadow of cinematic splendor. Even Roger Moore, who'd passed away in 2017, seemed to echo through the archives with his own past praises. Connery's death wasn't just the loss of an actor, it was the closing of a chapter. For many, he was James Bond, the first, the best, the one who made the character more than just a Cold War fantasy. His passing didn't stop production on The Man with the Golden Gun. That ship had sailed decades ago, but it halted something bigger, the living connection to the franchise's golden age. Think about it. When Connery was alive, there was still a tangible link to that era, when Bond was new, raw, revolutionary. His voice, his laugh, his stories, they kept it breathing. With him gone, that era didn't just fade, it froze, preserved in amber like a relic from a time we'll never get back. Let's linger on that for a moment. The Man with the Golden Gun might have been a Roger Moore film, but it carried the weight of Connery's influence. The villain, Scaramanga, was pitched as the dark mirror of Bond, a concept that only works because Connery gave Bond such depth to reflect. The film's stakes, its style, even its flaws, they all trace back to the foundation Connery built. His death didn't rewrite history, but it shifted how we see it. Suddenly every Bond film, even the ones he didn't star in, became a monument to what he started. And The Man with the Golden Gun, caught in that awkward post-Connery limbo, feels like the moment the franchise realized it could never fully escape him. But there's more to this story than Bond. Sean Connery was a man of contradictions. Born in 1930, in Edinburgh, Scotland, he grew up poor, delivering milk and laying bricks before fame found him. He was a bodybuilder, a sailor, a coffin polisher, yes, you heard that right, before he stumbled into acting. When he landed Bond, he wasn't polished or posh, he was rough around the edges, a working-class kid who fought for every inch of his success. That grit bled into his 007, giving the character a humanity that no amount of gadgets could replicate. Off-screen, he was just as fierce, stubborn, outspoken, a proud Scot who championed independence and didn't suffer fools. His later years were quieter, but no less impactful. After The League of Extraordinary Gentlemen in 2003, he retired, fed up with the industry's chaos. "I'm done," he said, and he meant it. He spent his days golfing, reading, living life on his terms. When he died, it wasn't a shock, he'd been frail for years, but it was a gut punch. Because even at 90, Connery felt eternal. His death didn't just halt an era, it reminded us that even legends are mortal. So where does that leave The Man with the Golden Gun? It's not Connery's film, but it's part of his orbit. It's a piece of the puzzle he started assembling back in '62. His tragic death didn't stop the cameras from rolling in '74, but it did something more profound. It drew a line in the sand. Before October 31st, 2020, we could imagine him still out there, grumbling about Hollywood, sipping a whiskey, maybe even smirking at the latest Bond. After that day, he was gone, and with him went the last living echo of 007's origin story. The franchise marches on, new actors, new films, but it's built on a foundation that Connery laid, brick by rugged brick. In the end, the tragic death of Sean Connery halted The Man with the Golden Gun is bigger about one movie. It's about a man who gave us a hero, and left us to wrestle with his absence. It's about how a single life can ripple through decades, touching films he starred in, and films he didn't. Sean Connery wasn't just Bond, he was the spark that lit the fuse. And when that spark went out, it didn't just dim the lights on his story, it cast a shadow over everything he touched, from Dr. No to The Man with the Golden Gun and beyond. So here's to you, Sean, shaken, not stirred forever. If his legacy moves you, stick around. There's more where this came from, tales of Hollywood giants who shaped our world, one frame at a time. Hit that subscribe button, and let's keep the story going.